Welcome to our deep dive, everybody. Buckle up, because today we're taking a trip back to 19th century America. We're going to dig into the wild world of political conspiracy theories.
Ooh, conspiracy theories. Sounds juicy.
It is. We're talking about a young nation still figuring things out, grappling with huge issues like slavery and immigration. It was like a breeding ground for suspicion and speculation.
I can only imagine. People probably needed someone or something to blame for all the upheaval.
Exactly. And that's where these theories come in. We'll be looking at an article from IDN Times called 10 Teori Konspirasi Tergila dalam Politik Amerika Abad ke-19.
We're going to see how even the most outlandish theories actually shaped events. It's going to be fascinating. Ready to dive in?
Absolutely. Let's do it.
Okay, let's kick things off with the Illuminati panic. Picture this. It's the late 1700s, and a preacher named Jedediah Morse is freaking everyone out about the Bavarian Illuminati.
The Illuminati, like the secret society. Yep, that's the one. Morse is claiming they're infiltrating America, aiming to overthrow the government and wipe out Christianity. You know, the usual...
Classic villain stuff.
Right. And to make things even spicier, Morse links future President Thomas Jefferson to this whole conspiracy.
Whoa, hold on. Thomas Jefferson, the Declaration of Independence guy.
The one and only. Reading this, it just struck me how people were grasping at straws, looking for someone to blame, even if it was this shadowy group across the ocean.
It makes sense, though, in a way. Revolution's in the air, things are changing rapidly, people are scared, and they need someone to point a finger at.
And Morse was a master at tapping into that fear.
Oh, absolutely. He was incredibly clever. He connected the Illuminati to the French Revolution, to secularism, all these things people were already anxious about. And by targeting Jefferson, who represented those radical Enlightenment ideas, he could discredit him politically.
So it was all about political maneuvering, using fear as a weapon.
In a way, yeah. But here's the kicker. The Illuminati themselves were already gone. They had disbanded back in Bavaria. They were a convenient scapegoat, the symbol of hidden forces controlling everything.
So it was like a phantom menace, basically, this shadowy group that wasn't even really there anymore.
Exactly. But the fear they inspired was very real.
But did this fear actually lead to anything concrete? Was it just paranoia, or did it have real-world consequences?
Oh, it definitely had consequences. Think about it. This fear of the Illuminati fueled a distrust of anything that seemed intellectual, foreign, or elitist. It created a climate of suspicion where political opponents were demonized, painted as enemies of the state, controlled by this evil hidden force.
So instead of addressing real issues, it was all about blaming this imaginary enemy.
Sadly, yes. And that pattern repeats throughout history.
That's pretty disturbing. Okay, let's shift gears a bit. Let's talk about the Know-Nothing Party. Mid-1800s, America's seeing a wave of immigration, especially from Ireland, and this triggers a huge nativist backlash.
Oh, yes. The Know-Nothings. A fascinating, albeit troubling, group.
And they were masters at exploiting this anti-immigrant sentiment. They spread all sorts of wild rumors about Irish Catholics, we're talking. Baby killing, kidnapping, secret allegiance to the Pope, you name it.
Wow, some serious accusations. Was there any truth to these claims? Or was it just pure fabrication to stir up trouble?
Pure fabrication. They knew how to play on people's fears. Think about it. Economic competition, Protestants clashing with Catholics, and this deep-seated fear of being overtaken by the other.
So the Know-Nothings just tapped into those existing anxieties and blew them out of proportion.
Precisely. And the worst part, those fears turned into concrete actions. Our source talks about laws being passed to restrict alcohol and immigration, making life incredibly difficult for Irish Catholics.
So we see how these conspiracy theories, even if completely made up, can have very real and often very negative consequences.
It's scary how whispers and rumors can actually shape policy. And honestly, it feels relevant even today, right?
Yeah.
We still see certain groups being scapegoated for complex problems.
You're absolutely right. It's like this cycle that repeats throughout history, and the tactics and the anxieties might change, but the underlying mechanism stays the same.
It's like this primal fear of the other that keeps rearing its ugly head.
Sadly, yes. And that fear can be incredibly potent, especially when it's exploited for political gain.
Well, we've got the Illuminati, the Know-Nothings. And things are about to get even more intense as we head towards the Civil War. The nation is divided over slavery, and you can bet that conspiracy theories are adding fuel to the fire.
Oh, yeah. This is where things get really serious. When you have a nation on the brink of war, any spark can ignite the powder keg.
The South was convinced that Northern abolitionists, maybe even with help from the British, were plotting to destroy their way of life. And some people even saw Lincoln and the whole Republican Party as part of this Black Republican conspiracy to empower Black Americans at the expense of white Southerners.
It's interesting, though, because those fears weren't totally unfounded. Abolitionists were working to end slavery, and some in the North did believe in racial equality. The conspiracy theories just took these real movements and twisted them into existential threats.
So it's like they took a kernel of truth and weaponized it.
Exactly. And it worked. Those theories reinforced the South's sense of victimhood and justified their opposition to any compromise on slavery.
It's like each side was trapped in their own bubble of fear and suspicion, unable to see the other side's perspective.
Precisely. And that lack of communication, that inability to find common ground, is incredibly dangerous, especially when tensions are already running high.
And it wasn't just the South that was spinning conspiracy theories. Abolitionists also had their suspicions. They saw a massive pro-slavery conspiracy working behind the scenes, blocking any progress towards emancipation.
It's almost like each side was projecting their own anxieties onto the other. They both saw themselves as victims of this grand conspiracy, which made any kind of dialogue or compromise practically impossible.
It's tragic how these opposing narratives contributed to the outbreak of war.
It really highlights how powerful stories can be, even if they're based on falsehoods or distortions. They can shape perceptions, fuel animosity, and ultimately lead to real-world violence.
And even after the war ended, the conspiracy theories didn't stop. Lincoln's assassination became fertile ground for all sorts of speculation and accusations.
Oh, absolutely. The death of a president is always a shock, and in the aftermath, people are desperate for explanations, especially if the official story feels incomplete.
It's like people need to make sense of the chaos, even if it means creating elaborate narratives that might not be true.
Exactly. It's that human need to find order in a world that often feels random and unpredictable.
So Booth, the assassin, was caught and killed. But that didn't stop people from spinning alternative theories.
Right. People just couldn't believe he acted alone. Theories popped up blaming Confederate leaders, disgruntled Union officials. It was as if Lincoln's death had to be part of some grand conspiracy.
It's like they needed to believe there was a reason, a master plan behind this tragic event, rather than accepting it as a senseless act of violence.
I think it's a way of coping with trauma, of trying to impose order on a world that suddenly feels chaotic and out of control.
It's like we need to believe that even terrible things happen for a reason, that there's some logic, some meaning behind the chaos.
And that need for meaning, unfortunately, can sometimes lead us down some very dark and twisted paths.
Well, we've talked about the Illuminati, the know-nothings, and the conspiracies surrounding Lincoln's assassination. But now let's dive into a lesser-known incident. The shooting of President James Garfield in 1881.
Garfield's assassination. It's not one that's talked about as much.
Right. And this one takes a bizarre turn because the doctors treating him might have actually contributed to his death, all thanks to their own medical conspiracy theories.
Wait, what? Doctors? Spreading conspiracy theories?
It sounds crazy,
Yeah.
right? But at the time, antiseptic techniques were still pretty new, and some doctors were still clinging to this outdated idea called miasma theory.
Miasma theory. That's the one where people believed that bad air caused disease, right?
Yep. They thought that foul smells, especially from rotting stuff, could make you sick. So instead of focusing on germs and bacteria, they were worried about bad odors.
And somehow this impacted Garfield's treatment.
Big time. They were so convinced about miasma theory that they rejected practices that could have saved his life. It's almost like they blamed bad air for his worsening condition instead of, the bullet wound and possible infection.
It's hard to believe that even doctors, people we trust with our health, could fall prey to such misinformation.
It's a stark reminder that even experts can be wrong, and sometimes their biases can have deadly consequences.
It really underscores the importance of critical thinking, regardless of who's presenting the information. We should always question assumptions, demand evidence, and consider multiple perspectives.
Well said. Now let's move on to our final example for this segment. We're going to talk about the Chinese Exclusion Act and the wave of racist conspiracy theories that paved the way for its enactment. We're talking late 19th century now, a time of rapid change and social upheaval.
The Chinese Exclusion Act, that was a dark chapter in American history.
It really was. America was undergoing rapid industrialization, and with it came all sorts of economic anxieties. Chinese immigrants became scapegoats, accused of stealing jobs, depressing wages, and threatening American culture.
It's that classic us versus them narrative that we've seen so many times throughout history.
Exactly. But this case goes beyond simple economic competition. These theories tapped into deep-seated racial fears, portraying Chinese immigrants as a threat to the very fabric of American society.
So it wasn't just about jobs, it was about this idea that Chinese people were inherently different, unassimilable, a danger to the American way of life.
And these fears had devastating consequences. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 effectively slammed the door on Chinese immigration for decades.
It's a chilling example of how prejudice, fear, and conspiracy theories can be used to justify discrimination and the erosion of basic human rights.
It's a stark reminder that we're not so far removed from our past. The same patterns of scapegoating and exclusion can still emerge, targeting different groups, but always drawing on that same primal fear of the other.
It's a reminder to be vigilant, to challenge prejudice wherever we see it, and to remember that history has a way of repeating itself if we're not careful.
Before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I'd like to ask you, what's the most important takeaway from all of this? What should our listeners really remember about these 19th century conspiracy theories?
I think the most crucial thing is to understand that these conspiracy theories weren't just random ideas or the ramblings of a few fringe individuals. They were deeply connected to the anxieties and power dynamics of the time. They reflected real fears, however distorted or exaggerated those fears might have been.
So it's not just about debunking the theories themselves, it's about understanding the context, the motivations behind them.
Exactly. It's about seeing them as symptoms of deeper social and psychological currents. And it's important to recognize that those currents still flow today, even if the specific anxieties and targets have changed.
It's chilling to think about, but also a crucial insight. We can't just dismiss conspiracy theories as relics of the past. We have to understand what makes them so appealing, so potent, and how they can still influence us today.
Absolutely. And that understanding starts with recognizing our own vulnerabilities to these kinds of narratives. We all have biases, blind spots, areas where our critical thinking can falter.
So studying history can help us understand not just the past, but ourselves, our own susceptibility to these patterns of thinking.
Precisely. It's a reminder that vigilance, critical thinking, and a willingness to question our own assumptions are essential tools for navigating the world, both now and in the future.
Well said. We'll be right back after a quick break to continue our exploration of these fascinating and often unsettling theories.
You know, it's funny, we often label these theories as irrational, but there's a kind of logic to them, isn't there?
Oh yeah, totally. Conspiracy theories offer these simple, easy-to-grasp explanations for a world that's anything but simple.
Exactly. It's like they provide a sense of control when things feel overwhelming and chaotic.
So instead of wrestling with all the nuance and messiness of reality, it's easier to just point a finger and say, aha, it's the Illuminati. Or those immigrants. They're the ones pulling the strings.
Right. So seductive, especially when those theories tap into our existing prejudices and fears.
It's not just about explaining events. It's about validating what people already believe. It feeds into their sense of grievance, their outrage.
Like we saw with the slavery debate. Those conspiracy theories about abolitionists wanting to destroy the South, they weren't just random ideas. They mirrored the very real anxieties of white Southerners. They were afraid of losing their power, their entire way of life.
And on the flip side, abolitionists saw this massive pro-slavery conspiracy everywhere because they were deeply suspicious of the system. They felt like it was rigged against them, protecting slaveholders at every turn.
It's almost like these theories are less about truth and more about power dynamics.
It's about who has power, who's losing it, and who's trying to grab it.
You got it. And that's what makes them so potent. They tap into these raw nerves of power and identity, the deeply held beliefs about who the good guys and the bad guys are.
It's like a constant struggle to define who's in control and who's being controlled.
Absolutely. And that struggle plays out through these narratives, these stories we tell ourselves about the world.
So we've established that these 19th century conspiracy theories weren't just harmless chatter. They reflected deep anxieties, they were tied to power struggles, and they had a real impact on history. But were people just less informed back then? More superstitious? Is that why these theories were so prevalent?
That's a common assumption. But honestly, these same patterns of thinking are still alive and well today. We might have more information at our fingertips, but we're also bombarded with more misinformation than ever before.
So the internet has become this breeding ground for conspiracy theories.
Think about it. Social media algorithms create these echo chambers where people are constantly exposed to information that confirms their existing beliefs. And the speed at which information spreads, both true and false, makes it harder to separate fact from fiction.
It's like trying to drink from a fire hose. There's just so much information coming at you, it's hard to know what to believe.
Exactly. And we're also living through a time of immense change and uncertainty. Climate change, political polarization, economic inequality, rapid technological advancements. It's a lot to process.
It creates this feeling that things are spiraling out of control.
Right. And that feeling can make people more susceptible to easy answers and simplistic explanations. Conspiracy theories offer a sense of order in a world that feels increasingly chaotic.
So you're saying that these conditions, in a way, prime us for conspiracy thinking. The more chaotic and uncertain the world feels, the more we crave those black and white narratives.
I think there's definitely a correlation. When people feel threatened, powerless, or overwhelmed, they're more likely to grasp at any explanation that offers a sense of control, even if that explanation is based on flimsy evidence or outright fabrication.
Okay, so we're all potentially susceptible to this kind of thinking. But what can we do about it? Aside from staying informed, being critical of sources, the usual advice.
One of the most important things is to be aware of our own biases. We all have them, these ingrained beliefs and assumptions that color how we see the world.
It's about being honest with ourselves, recognizing when we might be drawn to a theory just because it confirms our existing worldview, not because it's actually true.
And it's about being willing to challenge those biases, to seek out information that contradicts our beliefs, to engage with people who have different perspectives.
So it's about humility, about being open to the possibility that we might be wrong, that our understanding of the world might be incomplete.
Exactly. It's not always easy. It takes courage to question what we hold dear. But it's essential if we want to avoid the pitfalls of confirmation bias and groupthink.
It's also about resilience, right? About developing the tools to navigate this complex information landscape.
Absolutely. We need to equip ourselves with the skills to critically evaluate information, to spot fake news and propaganda, to tell the difference between fact and fiction.
So it's not just about what we think, it's about how we think. We need to strengthen those critical thinking muscles so we don't get swept away by appealing narratives that might not hold up under scrutiny.
That's a great way to put it. And it's a lifelong process. There's no easy fix. But awareness, critical thinking, and healthy skepticism are great places to start.
So we've talked about the dangers of conspiracy thinking, its historical roots, and its relevance to today's world. But is there ever a time when this kind of thinking can be a positive force?
That's an interesting question. I think it's important to remember that questioning authority, challenging official narratives, and demanding transparency are all vital for a healthy democracy.
So it's about striking a balance between healthy skepticism and paranoia, between questioning things without assuming there's a grand conspiracy behind everything.
Exactly. It's about being discerning, about demanding evidence, about considering multiple perspectives without falling into the trap of believing that everyone in power is corrupt or that every explanation is a lie.
It's not about blind trust, but it's also not about rejecting everything outright. It's about finding that middle ground where critical thinking and open-mindedness can coexist.
It's about being thoughtful, about engaging with the world in a curious and critical way.
I like that. Now, before we move on to our final thoughts, I want to revisit something we touched on earlier. This idea that conspiracy theories often provide a sense of order and control in a chaotic world. What if, instead of trying to debunk these theories head-on, we focused on addressing the underlying anxieties and needs that make them so appealing in the first place?
That's a really intriguing idea. Instead of arguing about the facts, we could focus on creating a sense of stability, security, and community, meeting those deeper needs that often drive people towards simplistic explanations and scapegoats.
So it's about building a world where people feel less threatened, less powerless, less vulnerable to those narratives that prey on fear and uncertainty.
Imagine a world where people feel secure in their livelihoods, where they trust their institutions, where they have strong social connections. In that world, would those conspiracy theories that offer easy answers and scapegoats be as appealing?
It's a fascinating thought. It's not just about debunking bad ideas. It's about creating an environment where those ideas are less likely to take root in the first place.
It's a long-term solution, no doubt. It requires systemic change, building trust, and fostering a sense of shared purpose. But it could be more effective than simply trying to win arguments or debunk every single theory that emerges.
It's about addressing the root causes, not just the symptoms.
It's a challenging task, but I think it's a worthwhile one. And who knows, maybe by understanding the history of these theories, recognizing the patterns, and addressing the underlying needs, we can create a future where those dark narratives have less power to divide and manipulate us.
Well said. Now let's lighten things up a bit. We've been talking about some pretty heavy stuff: fear, manipulation, social division. I'm curious, were there any conspiracy theories from the 19th century that were less politically charged? maybe even a little humorous in retrospect.
Actually, yeah, there's one that comes to mind. Remember my asthma theory? The idea that diseases were caused by bad air?
Oh yeah, like the smell of rotting garbage could make you sick.
Exactly. People were obsessed with avoiding bad smells. They used perfumes to mask odors, believing it would ward off disease. They even drained swamps and cleaned up cities, all in the name of fighting bad air.
It makes you wonder what our era's bad smell obsession will be in 100 years. Will future historians laugh at our hand sanitizer and air purifiers?
Maybe. But what's interesting about my asthma theory is that even though it was wrong, it led to some positive changes. The focus on sanitation and cleaning up urban environments, even if based on a flawed understanding, did improve public health.
So even incorrect theories can have unintended positive consequences. It's a reminder that progress isn't always a straight line. Sometimes we stumble our way towards better solutions, even if our initial understanding is flawed.
It also reminds us to approach scientific knowledge with a bit of humility. What we believe today might be seen as ridiculous tomorrow.
So there's a balance, right? Between being skeptical and being open to new ideas. Between questioning things and recognizing that our knowledge is always evolving.
Absolutely. It's about staying curious, staying engaged, and being willing to adjust our thinking as we learn more.
Well said. It feels like we've only just scratched the surface here.
Oh, for sure. The 19th century was a breeding ground for all sorts of wild theories. We haven't even touched on stuff like the Freemasons or the theories about financial panics and economic crashes.
It's amazing how these theories seem to pop up whenever there's some big event or crisis. It's like people need to find a story, some narrative, to explain the chaos.
It goes back to that basic human need for order, for control. When things feel random or unexplainable, we try to make sense of it, to connect the dots, even if it means relying on speculation or wishful thinking.
Right, right. It's like that saying, never attribute to malice what can be adequately explained by stupidity. But sometimes people just prefer the malice explanation. It's more exciting, more dramatic.
And it often plays right into our biases. If you already distrust the government or a certain group, then any theory that reinforces those suspicions is going to be way more appealing than one that challenges them.
It's not always about logic or evidence then. It's about psychology, about how our brains are wired to find patterns, to create stories.
Absolutely. We're storytelling creatures. We crave meaning. We want to believe things happen for a reason. And sometimes that leads us down some pretty strange and twisty paths.
Well, we've certainly gone down a few of those paths today. We've explored the Illuminati panic, the know-nothings, those anxieties about slavery and immigration, and even that bizarre case of President Garfield and the whole miasma theory.
And it's been fascinating to see how so many of those themes are still relevant today. Those fears, the scapegoating, the distrust of authority, these patterns keep popping up, even if the specific targets and stories change over time.
It's a little unsettling, isn't it, to realize that we're not so different from those 19th century Americans. We might have more technology, more information, but we're still grappling with a lot of the same challenges.
Totally. We're still dealing with uncertainty, with fear, with this need to find simple answers in a world that's incredibly complex.
And that's why it's so important to be aware of these patterns, to understand the psychology of conspiracy thinking, to really hone those critical thinking skills that can help us make sense of all this information flying around.
Couldn't agree more. It's essential for navigating the world today.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave everyone with a few key takeaways. Number one, conspiracy theories aren't just harmless fun. They can have real consequences. They shape people's beliefs, influence actions, and sometimes they can even lead to violence.
And number two, be mindful of your own biases. What stories are you drawn to? What information do you tend to dismiss? Being able to challenge your own assumptions is a huge part of critical thinking.
And finally, always stay curious. Keep learning, keep asking questions, and never be afraid to change your mind when you're presented with new evidence or a different perspective.
The world's a complicated place. There's no shame in admitting you don't have all the answers. But by being thoughtful, engaged, and open-minded, we can approach that complexity with a little more clarity and a little less fear.
That's a great way to put it. So to everyone listening, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the weird and fascinating world of 19th century American conspiracy theories. Hopefully you found it informative, thought-provoking, and maybe even a little entertaining.
And until next time, stay curious, stay critical, and keep those minds open.